The president of the Indiana Fever just compared Caitlin Clark's team to Apple, and what fans heard next had the entire WNBA talking for months. But here's the part almost nobody is talking about. Buried inside that comment was a signal about exactly how the Fever planned to treat their championship window. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why some fans think the front office is about to make the biggest mistake in franchise history. Stick around, because what happens in the final few minutes of this story changes everything you think you know about this team. Before we get into it, if you're someone who follows the Fever, follows Caitlin Clark, or just loves a good front office drama, hit subscribe right now. We break down stories like this one every single week, and trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming in the next few videos. Okay, let's get into it. Every so often in sports, one offhand comment ends up saying more than the person who said it ever intended. It's not a scandal, it's not an insult. It's just a sentence that, once it's out in the world, takes on a life of its own. That's precisely what happened to Indiana Fever president Kelly Krauskopf. She wasn't trying to start a fight. She was trying to describe a vision. But somewhere between her mouth and the internet, that vision turned into one of the most argued about moments in recent WNBA history. It started as a fairly normal conversation about how to build a franchise that lasts. By the time it was done circulating online, it had turned into a referendum on whether the people running the Indiana Fever actually understand what they have in Caitlin Clark. Because here's the thing about generational talent. It doesn't just change a stat sheet, it changes the pressure on everyone around it. Every roster decision gets put under a microscope. Every press conference gets dissected sentence by sentence. Every mistake, real or perceived, becomes a referendum on leadership. And the wild part? This entire controversy was never really about one quote. The quote just cracked the door open. What walked through that door is the real story. As Clark's influence on the league kept growing, so did the questions about Indiana's long game. Fans stopped just cheering for wins. They started studying transactions. They started picking apart depth charts. They started asking out loud whether the front office was moving with enough urgency to actually cash in on the most valuable window the franchise has ever had. Meanwhile, the spotlight on Indiana kept getting bigger. Every game became appointment viewing. Every Clark highlight became a national story. Every injury update became breaking news. The franchise that used to fly under the radar was suddenly one of the most watched organizations in all of professional sports. So when expectations rose that fast, naturally, people started asking whether the people in charge were rising with them. Here's what makes this whole saga so fascinating. Two completely reasonable people can watch the exact same events and walk away with opposite conclusions. One camp sees a smart front office trying to build something that lasts beyond any single player. The other camp sees an organization moving in slow motion while sitting on the most valuable asset in the league. One side says patience wins championships. The other side says every year without a title is a year you never get back. And right in the middle of that tug of war stands Caitlin Clark, a player whose presence has reshaped not just one franchise, but the entire business of women's basketball. Attendance, television deals, merchandise, cultural relevance. There's barely a corner of the sport her arrival hasn't touched. Stay with me here, because the deeper we go into this story, the more it starts looking less like a single controversy and more like a slow-burning question that still hasn't been answered. Does the Fever front office actually see this moment the way their own fans see it? So let's rewind to where this actually began. Kelly Krauskopf wasn't trying to make headlines. She was talking about building something durable, a brand that wouldn't depend on any single hot streak or any single star to stay relevant. On its face, that's exactly the kind of long-term thinking you'd want from an executive. But then came the comparison that changed everything. She said she wanted the Fever to become the kind of lasting brand that Apple is. In her mind, that was probably about consistency, about building something so sturdy it could survive any storm. What she may not have fully anticipated was how fast fans would connect the dots between that comparison and the one player who had already completely transformed the franchise's reality. Because here's the thing about the word Apple. It doesn't just conjure up a successful company. It conjures up a face, a visionary, the person so tied to that brand's rise that you can't really separate the man from the company. Steve Jobs. And that's exactly where a lot of fans' minds went. Instead of hearing a comment about long-term organizational health, they heard something that sounded like it was filing Caitlin Clark away as one piece of a bigger corporate puzzle, rather than recognizing her as the actual engine behind everything that had just happened to this franchise. To plenty of supporters, that distinction wasn't small. It was everything. In their eyes, Clark wasn't simply a great player helping a good organization get better. She was the reason the Indiana Fever had become one of the biggest stories in American sports, period. That perception spread fast, because in 2026, nothing said by an executive, a coach, or a player stays contained for long. Fans started replaying the quote, debating what it really revealed about how the front office actually views the team's identity. Some defended Krauskopf, arguing that any front office thinking only about one player is setting itself up to collapse the moment that player leaves, gets hurt, or ages out. That's just how sports works. You build infrastructure, not shrines. Others weren't buying it. To them, the quote exposed something deeper. A front office that might be underestimating exactly how rare this moment is. Because from where they sat, the Fever weren't simply building a brand that happens to include Caitlin Clark. They were riding the wave of a generational athlete whose impact had already blown past anything the franchise had seen in over a decade. And here's where the timing makes everything worse, or better, depending who you ask. If Krauskopf had said this exact sentence 2 years earlier, nobody would have blinked. Nobody was watching the Fever back then. But by the time this quote went viral, fans had already seen sold-out road arenas, record-breaking TV ratings, and a level of national attention this franchise had never experienced. So any comment that even sounded like it was minimizing Clark's role hit differently. Now here's something worth sitting with for a second. Because what comes next in this story might completely flip how you see this whole debate. Keep watching. To really understand why this single comparison hit such a nerve, you need to rewind even further, back to what the Indiana Fever actually looked like before Caitlin Clark ever put on the jersey. This wasn't a contender quietly waiting in the wings. This wasn't a team racking up national television appearances. For years, Indiana was a franchise searching for relevance in a league getting more competitive by the season. They still had the history of a championship from over a decade earlier, but that banner felt further away with every passing year. Other franchises became the centerpiece of the league's storylines. Indiana mostly stayed in the background, a loyal fan base, sure, but a team the rest of the sports world had largely forgotten about. Then, almost overnight, that changed completely. When Caitlin Clark entered the league, she didn't arrive as just another promising rookie. Her college career had already become a national phenomenon. People who had never watched a single minute of women's college basketball suddenly knew her name. Her shooting range turned into a recurring social media event. Her competitiveness became its own storyline. By the time she declared for the draft, she wasn't a prospect anymore. She was a cultural moment. Nobody could say for sure if that level of hype would survive the jump to professional basketball. College stardom doesn't always translate, but it became obvious almost immediately that this was different. Arenas around the league started selling out the moment Indiana showed up on the schedule. Teams that almost never filled their seats were suddenly scrambling to find bigger venues. Networks that had treated WNBA broadcasts as filler programming were now fighting for premium time slots whenever the Fever played. Week after week brought a new attendance record, a new ratings milestone, a new sign that something historic was unfolding in real time. And the truly remarkable part? This phenomenon wasn't contained to Indiana. It followed Clark everywhere. Road games became events. Opposing franchises cashed in financially just from hosting her. Merchandise sales spiked across the league. The conversation around women's basketball spilled out of its usual circles and landed in mainstream sports media every single day. That's exactly why so many fans reject the idea that Clark is just another piece of a bigger organizational plan. To them, she isn't contributing to Indiana's growth, she is the growth. And that distinction shapes everything about what fans expect next. This is exactly the kind of context that makes the Apple comment land so differently. And it's also exactly why what happened next became impossible to ignore. Because the frustration didn't stay contained to one quote. It built, piece by piece, into something much bigger. Let's get into that. The backlash toward the Fever front office didn't appear overnight. It wasn't born from one press conference or one roster decision. It built slowly, the way pressure always does, quietly accumulating until it couldn't be ignored anymore. For years, Fever fans were patient because a rebuilding team demands patience. But once Clark arrived, that patience had an expiration date in a lot of fans' minds. The conversation stopped being about where this franchise might be in 5 years. It became about what the organization was doing right now, today, this season, to take full advantage of one of the rarest opportunities in modern sports. And that's exactly why the Apple comparison became such a lightning rod. It felt to a lot of supporters like confirmation of a fear that had already been quietly forming, that the front office was thinking in decades, while the fan base was thinking in months. Fans weren't interested in 10-year brand strategies. As far as they were concerned, the Fever had already won the lottery. They had the player capable of pulling in elite free agents, selling out arenas, and rewriting the league's national profile. The only question that mattered was whether the front office was moving fast enough to turn that opportunity into actual championships. Social media turned the temperature up even more. Every interview, every roster move, every offhand quote got analyzed like it was playoff strategy. Some fans questioned whether the roster had enough veteran depth. Others wondered whether the pieces around Clark actually complemented her game. Every loss reopened the same debate. Every setback became fresh evidence in an ongoing trial about whether this front office truly understood the moment. And here's where things get messy, because a lot of this conversation was built on speculation, not confirmed fact. Rumors started circulating about internal disagreements over team-building philosophy. Reports claimed some decisions were being made with long-term business interests in mind, rather than this season's championship hopes. None of that was ever fully verified, but in modern sports, perception doesn't need verification to spread. Once enough people start questioning an organization's priorities, every single move becomes proof, whether it actually is or not. Then injuries entered the conversation, and that's when everything changed. Stick with me, because what happens next in this story is the part that actually made fans stop arguing about branding and start talking about something far more urgent: time. Before injury concerns entered the picture, most fans treated Indiana's future like it was unlimited. Clark was young. She was already rewriting the record books. There would obviously be plenty of time to build the perfect roster around her, plenty of seasons, plenty of chances. But sports has a brutal way of punishing that kind of assumption. The moment an injury enters the story, even a relatively minor one, the entire timeline shifts in people's minds. Years that once felt guaranteed suddenly feel a lot more fragile. When Clark dealt with a health setback during the season, the conversation around the Fever shifted almost instantly. Fans who had spent months talking about attendance records and TV ratings suddenly started talking about something completely different: the championship window. That limited stretch of time when a team has its best shot at building around a generational talent before circumstances, age, injuries, league shifts start closing the door. Nobody knows exactly how long a window like that stays open. Some last a decade, others slam shut almost as fast as they opened. and injuries are very often the reason why. Suddenly, fans were asking harder questions. Was the roster deep enough to survive Clark missing time? Were there enough proven veterans in place? Was the front office doing enough to lighten the load Clark was carrying every time she stepped on the floor? Here's why this mattered so much. Clark's value to this franchise was never just about box scores. She is the face of the organization, the center of national media coverage, the single biggest reason casual fans even know the Fever exist. When a player carrying that much weight goes down, even briefly, it exposes an uncomfortable truth that every front office tries to avoid admitting out loud. Some players are simply irreplaceable. And for fans who already had doubts about the organization's urgency, the injury didn't create those doubts, it confirmed them. Every missed game became a reminder that opportunities are finite. Every recovery update became one more reason to demand faster, bolder decisions. But just when it felt like the temperature couldn't get any higher, one more event arrived that reignited the entire debate from scratch. And this time, it wasn't a quote. It wasn't an injury. It was a roster decision nobody could fully control. Keep watching, because this next part might be the single biggest test of whether Indiana's front office truly understands what's at stake. Just as the conversation was shifting toward urgency, the league's expansion draft landed right in the middle of it and reopened nearly every wound that had been building for months. On paper, there was nothing unusual happening. Expansion is just part of a growing league. New franchises need players. Existing teams lose pieces they'd rather keep. Every front office understands these rules long before the process even starts. But theory and reality feel very different when the team losing players believes it's supposed to be building toward a championship right now. The individual losses weren't franchise-shattering on their own. Every team loses depth pieces in an expansion draft. That's normal business. What made this moment land so hard with Fever fans was the timing. Indiana wasn't an ordinary franchise, quietly rebuilding in the background anymore. It had become one of the most closely watched organizations in basketball. The standards had changed. And fans weren't judging these moves the way you'd judge a rebuilding team's roster churn. They were judging them the way you'd judge a true championship contender's roster churn. That shift in perspective turned what might have been a forgettable offseason transaction into a much bigger conversation about priorities. For a fan base already rattled by the Apple comment and the injury scare, every departing player felt like one more reminder that windows close faster than anyone expects. To be fair, there were reasonable arguments on both sides here. Supporters of the front office pointed out that expansion drafts force every team to make hard choices. Losing players doesn't mean a franchise failed. It means the league grew. Smart organizations adjust and move forward. But critics weren't arguing about the mechanics of an expansion draft. They were arguing about timing, about a roster losing depth at the exact moment fans believed the championship window had never been more urgent. And here's the twist that almost nobody saw coming. Despite every bit of controversy, the Apple comment, the injury scare, the expansion draft fallout, something happened behind the scenes that completely contradicts the narrative critics had been building for months. Players around the league weren't running away from Indiana. They were trying to get in. And that one detail might be the biggest contradiction in this entire story. Because if the front office really were mismanaging this opportunity the way some fans believe, why would the rest of the league be lining up to join them? Before we get to that final twist, there's one more thread in this story we have to pull on. Because for a while, one of the loudest narratives surrounding Caitlin Clark had nothing to do with the front office at all. It had to do with her own teammates. The theory went something like this. Clark arrived with a level of media attention, endorsement money, and national spotlight that no other player on that roster had ever experienced. And some people online started wondering, could that kind of imbalance create resentment inside the locker room? It's the kind of theory that spreads fast because it sounds plausible. Sports history is full of examples where fame disrupted chemistry. So when commentators floated the idea, Plenty of fans were ready to believe it. The problem? There was barely any real evidence behind it. Every grainy clip, every facial expression caught on camera, every quiet moment after a tough loss got dissected online as if it were secret proof of a feud. Fans built entire narratives out of body language. But almost none of the people pushing these theories were actually inside that locker room. And as the season went on, the people who actually were inside that locker room started telling a very different story. Lexie Hull, who shares the court with Clark every single day, pushed back directly on the idea of internal tension. Her take wasn't that teammates resented the attention, it was that the attention itself was coming from outside the building, not from within it. That's a completely different story. One version says the team is falling apart from the inside. The other says the team is dealing with pressure created entirely by everyone watching from the outside. Sophie Cunningham, who had played for another franchise before joining Indiana, offered a similar perspective, one shaped by actually having something to compare it to. According to her, players across the league were well aware of what Clark's presence meant for the sport's visibility. That awareness didn't necessarily breed resentment. If anything, it created motivation. Teams wanted to beat Indiana. Opponents wanted to prove themselves against the league's biggest attraction. The intensity fans were sensing wasn't coming from teammates, it was coming from everyone else trying to knock the fever down. And then there's Clark herself. Through months of rumors and speculation, she never took the bait. She didn't lash out at critics. She didn't publicly defend herself in dramatic fashion. If anything, she often seemed almost amused that so many people online believed they understood a locker room they had never actually set foot in. The strongest evidence against the whole locker room tension narrative wasn't even verbal, it was visual. Teammates celebrating together after big wins, players jumping into each other's post-game interviews, the kind of unscripted chemistry that's genuinely difficult to fake on camera. If real resentment existed at the level some fans were claiming, it had an unusually good way of disappearing every single time emotions were running highest. None of this means the team was some perfect, conflict-free environment. Every locker room has friction somewhere. That's normal. But the gap between the online narrative and what players actually said in public was striking. The more people closest to the situation spoke up, the harder it became to support the idea that internal jealousy was the real problem here. Which raises an important question. If the issue was never really inside the locker room, then what exactly were fans so worried about? The answer wasn't below the surface. It was above it, in the front office, in the boardroom, in every decision about how to build around the most valuable player this franchise has ever had. And that's exactly where this story circles back to where we started. So let's zoom out for a second, because once you connect every piece of this story, the Apple comment, the injury scare, the expansion draft fallout, the locker room rumors that didn't hold up, a much bigger picture starts to form. This was never really one controversy. It was a series of moments that kept testing the same question over and over again. Does this organization actually grasp how rare this opportunity is? Front offices, by nature, have to think years ahead. They have to balance today's roster with tomorrow's cap space, today's lineup with next decade's draft picks. That's the job. Fans, on the other hand, rarely think in those terms, especially when they believe their team is sitting on a player who only comes along once in a generation. They don't want a 10-year plan. They want results this year, this season, while the iron is hot. That tension between long-term thinking and short-term urgency isn't unique to Indiana. It's a tension every successful franchise eventually has to navigate. But very few franchises navigate it under this much national attention, with this much riding on every decision, with a player whose impact reaches so far beyond the box score. And maybe that's the real story here. Not whether Kelly Krauskopf's Apple comparison was a good metaphor or a bad one. Not whether one roster move after the expansion draft was the right call. The real story is about an organization that suddenly found itself responsible for protecting and maximizing one of the most important athletes in the history of the sport, and a fan base that is watching every single move with the intensity of people who know exactly how rare this chance really is. If you've made it this far, you already know this story isn't really about one comparison to a tech company. It's about a franchise trying to figure out, in real time, how to handle the kind of opportunity that most organizations only dream about, and a fan base that refuses to let that opportunity slip by unexamined. So here's the real question heading into the next chapter of this story. Is Indiana's front office actually playing the long game brilliantly, quietly building something that will outlast any single player? Or are they sitting on the most valuable window in franchise history and moving just a little too slowly to make the most of it? Drop your take in the comments. And if you want to see how this story keeps unfolding, make sure you're subscribed, because the next update on this situation is coming soon, and trust me, it's going to change the conversation all over again.